Where there is smoke, there is fire. We chase it, we breathe it, and sometimes we choke on it. We all must deal with it. It is a constant in the firefighting environment, and knowing something about smoke is necessary to making sound decisions about how we allow it to affect us. Smoke impacts our physiological and mental well-being, and that impacts how well we are able to make risk management decisions. We'll take a look at the toxic soup of chemicals associated with smoke, what those chemicals do to us physiologically, the who, the where, and the when factors that indicate high risk. We'll also consider what actions we can take to reduce or avoid those effects. George Broyles is a fire and fuels project leader for the Forest Service Technology and Development Program, who will provide an overview and discuss in detail the various aspects of smoke.
As we're exposed to smoke, we tend to lose our cognitive ability, the ability to think clearly and act decisively. So safety first. Second of all is the health consequences. Exposure to smoke and the different irritants and particulates in smoke can have both short-term and potentially long-term consequences to our health. And finally, from our physical performance. As we're exposed to these particulates in smoke, our performance is going to degrade. Now, our firefighters go through a tremendous amount of effort to be at the top of their game and remain safe. And so exposure to smoke can compromise those things. So it's really important to think about.
Smoke is composed of numerous chemicals and particulates. At the head of this toxic freight train is carbon monoxide, which is hitched onto the aldehyde group, nitrogen and sulfur oxides, particulates, and crystalline silica.
Wildland smoke is really complex. There's a lot of chemicals, a lot of irritants and particulates in wildland smoke, and we could go on at length describing them, but I'm not a researcher and I'm not an epidemiologist, but we know for a fact that there's a few that are a specific concern for wildland firefighters. There's carbon monoxide, the aldehydes, acrolein, formaldehyde, and then particulates. So those are really the primary irritants of concern in wildland smoke. The particulates are really a concern. They're defined by classes, larger and smaller. And we see the larger particles out there. And our body has defense mechanisms, so we can prevent the largest particles from entering our body. But it's the small particles, which also make up the largest percent of the smoke, that are the concern, because they can enter the deepest recesses of our lungs. When we think about exposure to CO and to particulates, folks may want to know, well, what's the worst level or what's the best level and so forth. And it also depends on what we call the dose, both how much is in the atmosphere and how long that exposure lasts. So you may get a high exposure to CO for a short period of time and feel that. Or you could have a low exposure over an extended period of time, and the effects would be the same. Okay, so let's talk about carbon monoxide. That's fairly familiar and common to most folks, and it's going to be present in the smoke. As we breathe in carbon monoxide, we have some very definite physiological responses. Our heart rate's going to increase, our respiratory rate is going to increase. And so that carbon monoxide comes into our bloodstream and displaces the oxygen. So we have less oxygen available to our brain. Okay, we need oxygen in order to think clearly. Okay, we need oxygen in order to perform at our best. If our muscles and our brains are not getting oxygen, we're not going to be able to work and think at our best. In addition to that, your chemicals will cause headaches, eye irritation. The particulates are going to cause respiratory distress. So all of those different reactions start to take place in your body at the same time as you're exposed to them.
Carbon monoxide concentration is measured in parts per million. On average, at certain concentrations there are signs and symptoms you may feel. At 70 parts per million, you might feel a shortness of breath on vigorous exertion and a tightness around the forehead. At 120 parts per million, you might feel shortness of breath with moderate exertion and a headache with throbbing temples. At 220 parts per million, you might feel irritable, easily fatigued, have diminished judgment, dizziness, and dimmed vision. At 350 to 520 parts per million, you could experience confusion, collapse, and fainting on exertion. At 800 to 1200 parts per million, unconsciousness, convulsion, and respiratory failure may happen, with death following if exposure is prolonged. The good news is that getting into clean air will immediately start to combat these effects. Carbon monoxide levels in the blood can be halved with 4 to 6 hours of recovery time in clean air. George will discuss the short and long-term effects of smoke exposure and some of the telltale signs you may experience.
Sure. Short-term effects from multiple exposure incidents across a season. Certainly, if you're breathing a lot of particulates, it's going to continue to irritate your respiratory system, your throat, your nose, and your lungs, right? So that's going to make you more susceptible to coughs, to colds, to fatigue, and potentially bronchitis. You know, what we always call camp crud. And there may be other factors involved, certainly, but smoke exposure could be one of those contributing factors to bronchitis and those types of ailments. So yeah, long-term health consequences, that's an issue that's still under study, really, and we have suspicions because of work that's been done, again, with air pollution, with smokers in some third world countries, that folks that are exposed to smoke. But nothing definitive is out there right now, and that is something that we're working very hard at.
We know what the effects of smoke exposure are to a certain level and what symptoms to look for. But smoke isn't the only thing we deal with out there. Consider what you know about the effects of dehydration, heat stress and heat-related illness, fatigue, stress, and distractions. What are the effects of all these factors piled on top of each other? Do they exhibit synergistic effects when combined? Nobody really knows. So it is important to do everything possible to minimize each one to keep at the top of our game. Our mental state is impacted by smoke exposure, and so safety, risk management, and being able to follow the fire orders are also impacted.
Yeah, I really believe that there's a direct connection between exposure to smoke and how our ability to adhere to the fire orders can be impacted. And if we look at those fire orders, right, we need to think clearly and act decisively. So under potentially heavy exposures or a long-term exposure, it's going to be just more difficult to do that. Exposure to carbon monoxide and some of these other chemicals is going to affect and impact the way we can think and how well we're really thinking about what's going on and what we're doing. And so throughout the course of a shift, we're constantly going through this risk management process. And we're assuming that we're thinking clearly when we're doing that. But if our brain is being deprived of oxygen and we're making risk management decisions, we may not even know that they're faulty decisions because we're not thinking as clearly as we think we ought to be.
There are times and places that exposure to smoke is more prevalent than others. Mop-up, direct line construction, and holding the top three. We'll also consider the effects of smoke on the camp and ICP, and the negative effects of having the senior leadership of the team exposed to the effects of smoke.
We have a top three list of those times where our firefighters exceed safe exposure levels that are put out by OSHA and by NIOSH. So the top three, the first is going to be mop-up. When they're mopping up, we know that there's a high potential to exceed safe exposure levels. The other is direct hand line construction. And then when they're holding, both on prescribed fires and on wildland fires. Those are the three top times that we find folks getting exposed and exceeding safe levels. Right, let's talk about camps, right? There's a lot of work that goes on. Those folks work under stressful conditions. They work real long hours too, and they're making some very, very important decisions. Sometimes we need to make sure that the camp is located where there's clean air or provide clean air for those folks. Because whether it's low levels of CO, other chemicals, or certainly the particulates under an aversion, it has the ability to impair their thinking process.
There are some things we can do to reduce the effects of smoke exposure. There is also a simple way to assess your exposure.
The good news, because we've talked about things that can happen when you're exposed to smoke, the good news is that there's a lot we can do about it. There's a lot of simple steps that we can take to reduce our exposure. So let's talk about mop-up, right? We know that this is a time where folks get overexposed to CO, to particulate matter, even to crystalline silica as we start digging up that soil. What I like to tell folks is there's no rewards for doing excessive mop-up. We want to make sure that we're following those mop-up guidelines, and we don't need to exceed them. All we really need to do is keep that fire in check. So there's no rewards, and there's no rewards for going further in and chasing smokes and stumps way down that line there. If you're using water, use a light spray and let that soak in a little bit so that you don't disturb all that particles, all that dust, and start kicking it up with a heavy spray. So holding is another time again where we see high exposures, and folks sometimes exceed those safe exposures. It's a job that has to be done, we have to do it. But we need to think again about this. We certainly rotate folks out, our lighters and holders. Do we need to stand right on the line? A lot of times we don't. Sometimes folks are standing right on that line in the heaviest smoke and they can't see what they're supposed to be looking at anyway. So you might be able to move a little distance away, get in some cleaner air. You'll be able to see a little bit better and you'll still be able to react when you need to. Again, folks that are operating equipment, pumps and engines, try to move at a distance from them whenever you can. Don't park your vehicles, don't put your pumps, if you can, right where the smoke is at. Try to separate those two sources as much as possible. Direct hand line, that's tough because we've got to get out there, right? We want to put that line in. So it's a little more difficult, but sometimes those folks at the front of those lines that are pounding that line in there may need to come back and go to the tail end of that line, okay? Or sometimes if you can just kick back just for a minute, let that wind shift so that smoke is moving back into the fire instead of right back across the line. Sometimes it means giving up a little bit of ground. If we know that we're going to be in there for a long time and our folks are going to get hammered, we may just need to be prepared to give up a little bit of line. So how can you monitor? How can you know that the levels aren't safe? Well, I really believe the best way to do that is to listen to your body. When your eyes start to tear up, when your throat is getting scratchy, when it's more difficult to breathe, your body's giving you a very clear message that there's too much smoke in the atmosphere. That's your body trying to protect itself. As I mentioned, your body has mechanisms to prevent those large particulates, but those small particulates that are irritating your throat and are getting into your lungs, your body's saying, hey, we need to think and do something different here. So when that starts to happen, take a step back, reevaluate the situation.
As with all things that degrade our safety, if you see something, say something. You just may see something that those around you do not. Smoke adversely affects our mental and physiological well-being. This has a direct bearing on our ability to adhere to the fire orders, to being safe, and preserving the integrity of the risk management process. One of the problems of combating this is that once you are impaired, you are unable to judge the level of your own impairment. So look out for each other and be aware of the effects.